In first class aboard a luxury flight from LAX to Sydney, a grieving 5-year-old girl was about to face an unthinkable assault. A routine 14-hour journey turned dangerous when a traumatized flight attendant lost control and struck the child across the face. Steven Seagal wasn't your typical grandfather passenger. For 3 decades, he had been a classified CIA operative whose Hollywood career masked real-world black operations, known for eliminating high-value targets behind enemy lines. When Margot Hill's hand connected with Amelia's cheek, she had no idea she was facing a man who could have ended her life in 17 different ways. Seagal chose restraint over retaliation, launching a psychological operation that would transform everyone aboard. What began as a moment of inexcusable violence would become a masterclass in compassion over vengeance. Flight 447 and its 300 passengers would never be the same after discovering that sometimes the most dangerous man in the room is the one who refuses to fight. Before we jump back and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The whisper of leather seats and the soft hum of ambient lighting created a cocoon of luxury 35,000 feet above the Pacific. First class on the overnight flight from LAX to Sydney was a sanctuary of muted conversations, crystal stemware, and the kind of quiet that money could buy. Outside the windows, the California coastline was already fading into memory, giving way to the vast expanse of ocean that stretched endlessly toward Australia. Steven Seagal moved through the boarding tunnel with the unhurried gait of a man who had learned long ago that rushing was the enemy of awareness. His weathered hands carried only a small leather bag and a child's backpack decorated with cartoon butterflies. No entourage, no fanfare, nothing to announce his presence. The years had carved lines around his eyes, but they were laugh lines, mostly etched by decades of finding humor in life's absurd corners and joy in small moments with the granddaughter who walked beside him. "Grandpa, look how big the plane is," 5-year-old Amelia whispered, her eyes wide with wonder as they entered the aircraft. Her small hand gripped his tightly, a lifeline in the overwhelming world of international travel. She wore a pink sundress, with matching shoes, her dark hair pulled back in pigtails that bounced with each step. "Yes, sweetheart," Steven said softly, his voice carrying the gravel of age but steady as bedrock. "Big enough to carry us safely to our new home." The flight attendants recognized him, of course. Their eyes lingered a moment longer than professional courtesy required, but they understood this was a man who valued invisibility above recognition. He had disappeared from the spotlight years ago, after a mission in Southeast Asia went catastrophically wrong and cost him more than just his career. The daughter he'd raised alone, Amelia's mother, had died in a car crash 6 months ago. Now it was just the two of them, starting over in a place where the past couldn't follow. Steven found their seats, 3A and 3B, and helped Amelia climb into the window seat. She immediately began exploring the array of buttons and screens with the fascination that only a child could muster. "What does this one do, Grandpa?" she asked, pointing at the call button. "That's for when we need help," he said gently, guiding her hand away. "But right now, we just need to stay calm and let the nice people do their jobs." Across the aisle, an elderly Korean man was settling into his seat with the careful movements of someone who had earned his aches through service. Elias Ko, though Steven didn't know his name yet, glanced over and their eyes met briefly. There was recognition there, not the starstruck recognition of a fan, but the deeper acknowledgement of one warrior to another. Elias had served in Korea, had seen enough of life to recognize when a man carried himself with the particular weight of someone who had protected others at great personal cost. The boarding process continued around them in that particular rhythm of international travel, hushed efficiency punctuated by the rustle of carry-ons and the soft ping of overhead compartments. In premium economy, several rows behind them, Sasha Green was already live-streaming her pre-flight experience to her followers. "So we're about to take off for Sydney," she was saying to her phone camera, her voice pitched perfectly for social media consumption. 14 hours in the air, and I'm going to document every single moment of this journey. The food, the entertainment, maybe some interesting passenger interactions." She paused, scanning the first-class section visible through the gap in the curtain. You never know what kind of content you'll find at 35,000 feet. Sasha was 23, sharp-tongued and reactive, with the particular brand of confidence that came from having 800,000 followers hang on her every word. She had built her brand on being unfiltered, unafraid to call out what she saw as hypocrisy or pretension. To her, this flight was just another opportunity for content, another chance to build her audience by documenting the absurdities of air travel. In the galley, flight attendant Margot Hill was going through her pre-flight checklist with the mechanical precision of someone who had done this routine thousands of times. At 42, she was a seasoned professional who took pride in anticipating passenger needs before they were voiced. But today, something was off. Her hands shook slightly as she arranged the meal service, and she found herself double-checking things she'd already confirmed. It had been 3 weeks since she'd returned from bereavement leave. 3 weeks since she'd buried her 8-year-old daughter Emma, who had lost her battle with leukemia. The airline had been generous with time off, understanding with her need to grieve. But grief, Margot was learning, didn't follow corporate schedules. It lurked beneath the surface of routine, waiting for unexpected moments to surface like a rogue wave. "Margot, you okay?" asked Marcus Dean, the head of cabin crew, as he noticed her hesitation over the first-class meal selections. "Fine," she said quickly, too quickly. "Just making sure we have everything right." Marcus was a company man through and through, someone who had climbed the ranks by avoiding scandal and keeping passengers happy. He had a sharp eye for problems before they became incidents, and something about Margot's demeanor set off his internal alarms. But the flight was boarding, schedules had to be maintained, and he had learned that sometimes the best management was knowing when not to manage. "Take your time," he said diplomatically. "First service isn't for another hour." Back in first class, Amelia had discovered the entertainment system and was scrolling through the children's movies with the intense concentration that kids brought to important decisions. Stephen watched her with the mixture of love and protectiveness that had defined his life since becoming her guardian. She was resilient, stronger than any 5-year-old should have to be, but he could see the shadows that loss had cast over her bright spirit. "Can we watch this one?" she asked, pointing to an animated film about a lost puppy finding its way home. "Of course," he said, helping her with the headphones. "But remember, it's going to be a long flight. We don't have to watch everything at once." Captain Rebecca Allen's voice crackled over the intercom, warm and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're expecting smooth sailing for most of our journey to Sydney, with just some light turbulence as we cross the Pacific. Our flight time today will be approximately 14 hours and 20 minutes. As the plane pushed back from the gate and began its taxi to the runway, Stephen closed his eyes and let the familiar sensations wash over him. He had flown millions of miles over the decades, crossing oceans and continents in pursuit of justice, revenge, or simply the next mission. But this flight was different. This wasn't about going somewhere. It was about leaving something behind. The engines spooled up, that deep rumble that spoke of barely contained power, and the Boeing 777 lifted off into the California sky. Amelia pressed her face to the window, watching the city lights grow smaller below them. "Are you scared, Grandpa?" she asked, her voice small. "No, sweetheart," he said, taking her hand. "I'm right here with you. We're going to be just fine." But as the plane climbed toward cruising altitude and the first hints of turbulence began to jostle the cabin, Stephen couldn't shake the feeling that their journey was about to become more complicated than either of them had anticipated. 3 hours into the flight, the first signs of trouble began to manifest like storm clouds gathering on a distant horizon. The meal service had commenced with its usual choreographed precision, flight attendants moving through the aisles with practiced grace, but beneath the surface calm, tensions were building. Amelia had grown restless in her seat, the initial excitement of flying giving way to the particular kind of overstimulation that came from being confined in a small space, with too many new sights, sounds, and sensations. She had watched 2 movies, colored in her activity book, and eaten most of her kids' meal, but the long hours stretching ahead seemed insurmountable to a 5-year-old's attention span. "Grandpa, when are we going to get there?" she asked for the 4th time in 20 minutes, her voice carrying the edge of exhaustion that preceded a breakdown. "We still have a long way to go, sweetheart," Stephen said patiently, checking his watch. Why don't you try to get some sleep? I'll put your seat back and you can use the blanket. But sleep was the last thing on Amelia's mind. The cabin had grown warm, the recycled air making her feel stuffy and uncomfortable. When the plane hit its first real patch of turbulence, a series of bumps that sent ripples through the water glasses and caused the overhead bins to creak ominously, her composure finally cracked. I don't like this, she said, her voice rising in pitch. I want to go home. I want mommy. The words hit Stephen like a physical blow, but he kept his expression calm and steady. Amelia rarely mentioned her mother directly anymore, had seemed to accept their new reality with the adaptability of childhood. But grief, he knew, worked in cycles, surfacing at unexpected moments when defenses were down. I know, baby, said softly, unbuckling his seatbelt to comfort her better. I know you miss her, but remember what we talked about? Mommy would want us to be brave, to take care of each other. But the turbulence hit again, stronger this time, and Amelia's careful composure dissolved entirely. The tears came in earnest. Now, accompanied by the kind of inconsolable sobbing that could only come from a child who had lost too much too young. Her small body shook with the force of emotions too big for her to contain, and her cries echoed through the first-class cabin. Margot Hill was in the middle of serving the passenger in 2C when she heard the commotion. She turned to see the little girl in 3B crying hysterically while her grandfather tried unsuccessfully to soothe her. Something about the sound, the pitch, and intensity of a child in distress sent a jolt of panic through Margot's already frayed nervous system. It sounded exactly like Emma had sounded during those long nights in the hospital, when the pain had been too much and the medications weren't working, and all Margot could do was hold her daughter and whisper promises she couldn't keep. The similarity was so striking, so viscerally triggering, that Margot actually stumbled, nearly dropping the tray of meals she was carrying. "Ma'am, are you all right?" asked the passenger in 2C, reaching out to steady her. "Fine. I'm fine," Margot said, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. But she wasn't fine. The carefully constructed walls she had built around her grief were cracking, and the sound of Amelia's crying was like a hammer blow against her already fragile composure. She set down the meal tray with hands that shook visibly and moved toward the source of the disturbance. Stephen was kneeling beside Amelia's seat, speaking to her in low, soothing tones, but the child was beyond consolation. The turbulence had triggered something primal in her, a fear that went beyond the physical discomfort of flying. "Excuse me," Margot said, her voice sharper than she intended. "Is there a problem here?" Stephen looked up at her, his dark eyes taking in her flushed face and tense posture with the quick assessment of someone trained to read danger signs. "She's just scared," he said calmly. The turbulence upset her. "We'll get her settled down." But Amelia's cries seemed to be getting louder, more desperate, and other passengers were beginning to turn in their seats. In premium economy, Sasha Green had pulled out her phone, sensing that something dramatic was unfolding in first class. She began recording discreetly, her influencer instincts overriding any consideration for the family's privacy. "She needs to stop," Margot said, and there was something brittle in her voice that hadn't been there before. "She's disturbing the other passengers." "She's 5 years old," Stephen said, his voice still calm but with an undertone of steel. "She's scared and tired. Give us a moment." But Margot was beyond reason now. The sound of Amelia's crying had unlocked something inside her, a reservoir of pain and anger that she had been suppressing for weeks. It wasn't fair that this child got to cry, got to be comforted, got to have someone who would hold her and promise that everything would be okay. Emma would never cry again, would never need comforting, would never grow up to travel the world. "I said she needs to stop screaming," Margot repeated, her voice rising to match Amelia's cries. "Right now?" Amelia, frightened by the angry tone, reached out instinctively toward the flight attendant, seeking comfort from any adult figure. It was a child's natural response to distress, the same gesture that had once brought her mother running to her bedside during nightmares. But when Amelia's small hand touched Margot's arm, something inside the flight attendant snapped completely. All the grief, all the rage, all the helplessness she had been carrying erupted in a single, catastrophic moment of lost control. The slap rang out through the cabin like a gunshot. The sound was sharp, unmistakable, followed immediately by a gasp from the passengers who witnessed it. Amelia's crying stopped abruptly, replaced by a shocked silence that was somehow more disturbing than her tears had been. A red mark blossomed across her small cheek, and her eyes went wide with confusion and hurt. For a moment, the entire first-class cabin was frozen in disbelief. Even the plane's engines seemed to quiet, as if the aircraft itself was holding its breath. Margot stood over the child, her hand still raised, her face a mask of horror as she realized what she had done. Stephen rose slowly from his kneeling position, his movements deliberate and controlled. When he turned to face Margot, there was something in his eyes that made her take an involuntary step backward. Not anger, exactly, but something far more dangerous, a complete and utter stillness that suggested violence was not just possible, but inevitable. But Steven Seagal had learned long ago that the most powerful response to chaos was not more chaos. Instead of striking back, instead of unleashing the fury that burned in his chest, he simply looked at Margot with the kind of steady, unblinking gaze that could strip away pretense and expose the truth beneath. "Get me some ice," he said quietly, his voice carrying easily through the stunned silence. For her cheek, the simple request, delivered with such calm authority, broke the spell that had fallen over the cabin. Margot stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth as the full weight of her actions crashed down on her. Other passengers began to murmur, their voices creating a low buzz of shock and disapproval. And in premium economy, Sasha Green's phone continued to record, capturing every second of a moment that would soon change all of their lives in ways none of them could yet imagine. The aftermath of the slap hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon, acrid and impossible to ignore. In the terrible silence that followed, every passenger in first class held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Stephen Seagal knelt beside his granddaughter's seat, his large hand gently cradling her face as he examined the angry red mark that was already beginning to swell. Amelia stared up at him with wide, confused eyes, her small hand pressed against her cheek. The physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional shock of being struck by an adult she had trusted to keep her safe. Her bottom lip trembled, but she didn't cry. Something in her grandfather's calm presence told her that he would handle this, that she was protected now in ways that went beyond the physical. "Does it hurt, sweetheart?" Stephen asked softly, his voice carrying the gentleness he reserved. Only for her. She nodded mutely, and he leaned forward to kiss the top of her head, his lips lingering there for a moment longer than usual. When he straightened and turned to face Margot, the transformation was subtle but complete. The gentle grandfather was still there, but underneath, something far more dangerous had awakened. Margot stood frozen in the aisle, her face pale except for two bright spots of color on her cheeks. Her hands shook violently, and she seemed to be struggling to breathe. The magnitude of what she had done was crashing down on her like a tsunami, destroying the carefully constructed professional facade she had maintained for over 2 decades of service. She began, her voice cracking. "I didn't mean ice," Stephen repeated, his voice still quiet, but carrying an authority that cut through her stammering apology like a blade. Now, there was something in his tone that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to the primitive part of the brain that recognized apex predators. Margot didn't question the command. She simply turned and stumbled toward the galley, moving with the jerky motions of someone in shock. Behind them, passengers were beginning to react. An elderly woman in 1B was making soft, clucking sounds of disapproval, while the businessman in 2A was already reaching for his phone to document the incident. But it was the steady red light of Sasha Green's recording device in premium economy that posed the greatest threat to everyone involved. Sasha had been live streaming when the incident occurred, and her follower count was climbing rapidly as word of the drama spread across social media. Comments were flooding in faster than she could read them, a mixture of outrage, demands for justice, and the inevitable trolls who turned every tragedy into entertainment. "Oh my God, guys," she whispered into her phone, careful to keep her voice low. "Did you all see that? A flight attendant just slapped a little kid. Like, actually slapped her. This is insane." The clip was already being shared, reposted, and dissected across multiple platforms. Hashtag flight attendant slaps child was trending within minutes, and the story was taking on a life of its own. growing and mutating as it spread through the digital ecosystem. In the galley, Margot was fumbling with ice and a cloth napkin, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold onto anything. Marcus Dean found her there, leaning against the counter and hyperventilating. "Margot, what happened?" he asked, though the stricken look on her face told him everything he needed to know. "The passengers are talking about, I hit her," Margot said, the words coming out in a rush. "The little girl in 3B. She was crying and I lost it, Marcus. I actually hit a child." Marcus felt his stomach drop. In 15 years of managing cabin crew, he had dealt with every conceivable crisis except this one. Passenger complaints, medical emergencies, even the occasional drunk or disorderly traveler. All of those had protocols, procedures, ways to manage the situation. But a flight attendant assaulting a passenger? That was career-ending, lawsuit-generating, headline-making disaster. "Are you sure?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Maybe it just looked worse than it was. I slapped her across the face," Margot said flatly. "Hard enough to leave a mark. There's no walking this back, Marcus." Before Marcus could respond, Stephen appeared in the galley entrance. He moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent decades learning to navigate confined spaces quickly and quietly. His presence seemed to fill the small area, making both flight attendants acutely aware of how vulnerable they were. "The ice," Stephen said simply, extending his hand. Margot wordlessly handed him the improvised ice pack, unable to meet his eyes. Stephen accepted it without comment, but he made no move to leave. Instead, he stood there studying both of them, with the kind of patient attention that made people want to confess their sins. "Sir," Marcus began, his voice carrying the careful deference of someone trying to defuse a potentially explosive situation. "I want to apologize on behalf of the airline. This is absolutely unacceptable behavior, and I assure you that appropriate action will be taken." Stephen's dark eyes shifted to Marcus, and the head of cabin crew felt himself being evaluated in ways that had nothing to do with his professional credentials. There was something unsettling about the man's gaze, a depth that suggested he had seen and done things that most people couldn't even imagine. "What's her name?" Stephen asked quietly, nodding toward Margot. "Margot Hill," Marcus answered automatically. "She's been with us for 22 years. "This is completely out of character, Margot," Stephen said, and the flight attendant finally looked up at him. What she saw in his face wasn't anger or threat, but something far more unnerving. Compassion mixed with an absolute certainty that he could see straight through to her soul. "How long ago did you lose your daughter?" The question hit Margot like a physical blow. Her mouth opened and closed soundlessly, and all the color drained from her face. Marcus stared at Stephen in shock, wondering how he could possibly know something so personal, so devastating. 3 weeks, Margot whispered, her voice barely audible. "Emma. She was 8. Stephen nodded slowly, as if this explained everything. And perhaps it did. He had spent enough time around grief to recognize its signatures, the way it carved itself into people's faces and changed how they moved through the world. "And you came back to work too soon," he said. It wasn't a question. Margot's composure finally cracked completely. The tears came in a flood, 22 years of professional restraint washing away in an instant. She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with the force of sobs she had been suppressing for weeks. "I couldn't stay home anymore," she gasped between tears. "Everything there reminded me of her. I thought if I came back to work, if I focused on taking care of other people, maybe I could." "Maybe you could what?" Stephen asked gently. "Maybe I could forget," she whispered. "Maybe it would hurt less." Stephen was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of someone who had walked through his own valley of shadows. "It doesn't work that way," he said. "Grief isn't something you can outrun or bury under routine. It follows you wherever you go until you turn around and face it." Marcus watched this exchange with growing confusion and concern. The situation was spiraling beyond his ability to control, and he was beginning to realize that the quiet man in 3A was not just another passenger. There was something about him, an authority that had nothing to do with celebrity or wealth, that suggested he was used to taking charge of crisis situations. "Sir," Marcus said carefully, "I think we should discuss this privately. Perhaps we could arrange for you and your granddaughter to be moved to different seats, and we can work out appropriate compensation. Stephen's gaze shifted to Marcus, and the younger man felt himself being measured and found wanting. You want to move us, Stephen said. Separate us from the problem. Make it go away quietly. I'm trying to manage the situation professionally, Marcus replied, though he could hear the defensiveness in his own voice. The situation, Stephen repeated, his tone making the words sound distasteful. Is that what you call it when one of your employees assaults a 5-year-old child? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Marcus realized that he was facing a choice that would define not just his career, but his character. He could take the safe path, the corporate path, try to contain the damage and minimize the airline's liability. Or he could do what was right, regardless of the consequences. Before he could answer, Captain Rebecca Allen's voice crackled over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some light turbulence. Please return to your seats and ensure your seatbelts are fastened. But Stephen made no move to leave the galley. Instead, he stood there waiting, the ice pack slowly melting in his hands, while Margot continued to cry and Marcus struggled with the most important decision of his professional life. And in premium economy, Sasha Green's phone continued to record, the viewer count climbing toward 1 million as the world watched and waited to see what would happen next at 35,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean. The galley had become a confessional, a pressurized chamber where truths were being extracted like oxygen from the thin air outside. Stephen stood perfectly still, his presence somehow both calming and unsettling, while Margot's tears continued to flow and Marcus wrestled with decisions that would define the rest of his career. You know who I am, Stephen said quietly, and it wasn't a question. He had seen the flicker of recognition in Marcus's eyes, the subtle shift in posture that came when people realized they were dealing with someone whose reputation preceded him. Marcus nodded reluctantly. Steven Seagal, I've seen your movies. But that was a long time ago. Movies, Stephen repeated, and there was something almost sad in his voice. Is that what you think my life was about? Entertainment? Before Marcus could respond, Stephen continued, his voice carrying the weight of confession. I've spent 30 years of my life trying to protect people, he said. Sometimes successfully, sometimes not. I've seen what happens when good people break under pressure, when grief and trauma push them past their breaking point. And I've learned that the hardest thing isn't knowing what to do about the bad guys. It's knowing what to do about the good people who make bad choices. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He looked directly at Margot, who had finally stopped crying but was still trembling with the aftershocks of her emotional breakdown. You're not a bad person, Margot, he said gently. You're a grieving mother who came back to work before she was ready, who's been carrying pain that's too heavy for anyone to bear alone. What you did was wrong, inexcusable, but it doesn't define who you are. Margot looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes, searching his face for judgment and finding only understanding. How can you be so calm about this? She asked. I hurt your granddaughter. I struck a child. If I were you, I'd be angry. Stephen finished. Oh, I am angry. Furious, actually. But anger without purpose is just destruction. And destruction won't help Amelia heal, won't help you heal, won't solve anything. Marcus found himself leaning forward, drawn into this conversation despite himself. This wasn't how these situations were supposed to play out. There should have been lawyers and liability assessments and damage control. Instead, he was witnessing something that felt almost therapeutic, a masterclass in crisis management that had nothing to do with corporate protocols. What do you want? Marcus asked, though he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to hear the answer. Stephen considered the question for a long moment, his dark eyes seeming to look beyond the confines of the galley to some larger truth. I want Margot to get the help she needs, he said finally. Real help, not just a slap on the wrist and a notation in her personnel file. Grief counseling, trauma therapy, time to actually process what she's been through. He turned to Marcus, and the head of cabin crew felt the full weight of that steady gaze. I want your airline to take responsibility for putting a grieving employee back in a high-stress situation without proper support. I want policies changed so this never happens again to anyone else's child. And what about compensation? Marcus asked, though the question felt small and inadequate. I don't want your money, Stephen said simply. I want your accountability." Outside the galley, the drama was continuing to unfold in ways that none of them could control. Sasha Green had ended her live stream, but the damage was already done. The clip had been downloaded, shared, and reposted thousands of times. News outlets were picking up the story, and the airline's social media team was already in crisis mode, trying to contain a public relations disaster that was growing by the minute. But Sasha was beginning to have second thoughts about her role in the unfolding drama. She had built her following on being unfiltered and reactive, but watching the quiet dignity of the man in 3, it had triggered something unexpected. A moment of self-reflection that was deeply uncomfortable. She scrolled through the comments on her post, wincing at the vitriol and hate that her content had unleashed. People were calling for the flight attendant to be fired, arrested, sued into bankruptcy. The mob mentality of social media was in full effect, and she was the one who had lit the fuse. "Hey guys," she said quietly into her phone, starting a new video. "I want to talk about what just happened. Yeah, I recorded it, and yeah, it was messed up. But maybe we should all take a step back before we destroy someone's entire life over." A 30-second clip. The response was immediate and harsh. Her followers weren't interested in nuance or context. They wanted blood. The comments turned against her, accusing her of selling out, of being bought off, of losing her edge. Her follower count began to drop as quickly as it had risen. Back in the galley, Stephen was speaking directly to Margot now, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had navigated his own journey through grief and loss. "When my daughter died," he said quietly, "Amelia's mother, I thought I could handle it alone. I thought strength meant not needing anyone, not showing weakness. It took me years to learn that real strength sometimes means admitting you can't carry the weight by yourself." Margot was listening intently, hanging on every word. "Emma was everything to me," she whispered. "After her father left, it was just the two of us. She was so brave during her treatments, braver than I was. She used to tell me that everything would be okay, that we would get through it together." "But you didn't get through it together," Stephen said gently. "She died, and you survived. And now you have to figure out how to live with that." The words hit Margot like a physical blow, but they also carried a strange comfort. Someone finally understood. Someone finally saw the truth she had been hiding from everyone, including herself. "I don't know how," she admitted. "I don't know how to live without her." "You learn," Stephen said. "One day at a time, one breath at a time. You get help, you talk to people who understand, you let yourself grieve properly instead of trying to hide from it. And eventually, you find a way to carry her memory without letting it crush you." Marcus watched this exchange with growing amazement. He had expected threats, demands, legal posturing. Instead, he was witnessing something approaching grace, a level of emotional maturity that he wasn't sure he possessed himself. "Sir," he said carefully, "I have to ask, are you planning to file charges? To sue the airline?" Stephen looked at him for a long moment, and Marcus had the unsettling feeling that his entire character was being evaluated in that gaze. "That depends," Stephen said finally, "on what you do next." "What do you mean?" "I mean that Margot isn't the only one who made a choice today," Stephen said. "You have choices to make too. You can try to cover this up, minimize it, protect the airline's reputation at the expense of doing what's right. Or you can use this as an opportunity to examine your policies, your support systems, your responsibility to both your employees and your passengers." Marcus felt the weight of that responsibility settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. Everything he had been trained to do, every instinct honed by years of corporate culture, told him to contain the situation, limit liability, manage the narrative. But looking at Steven Seagal, at this man who had every right to be furious and vindictive but was instead choosing compassion, Marcus realized that he was being offered a chance to be better than he had ever been. "What would you want me to do?" he asked. "Start by getting Margot the help she needs," Stephen said. "Real help, not just a token gesture. Then look at your policies around bereavement leave, around support for employees dealing with trauma. Make sure this never happens again." He paused, his gaze shifting to include both Marcus and Margot. "And when we land, you face the consequences honestly. No spin, no corporate speak, just the truth about what happened and what you're going to do about it." As if summoned by their conversation, Captain Rebecca Allen's voice came over the intercom again. "Flight attendants, please prepare for descent." We'll be landing in Sydney in approximately 2 hours. The announcement seemed to break the spell that had fallen over the galley. Reality was rushing back, bringing with it all the complications and consequences that awaited them on the ground. But something fundamental had changed in those few minutes of honest conversation, something that would reshape all of their lives in ways they were only beginning to understand. Stephen turned to go, but Margot's voice stopped him. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you being so kind to me after what I did?" Stephen looked back at her, and in his eyes she saw depths of pain and loss that matched her own. "Because someone was kind to me when I needed it most," he said simply. "And because my granddaughter is watching. She needs to see that the world isn't just full of people who hurt each other. She needs to see that there are still people who choose compassion over revenge, healing over hate." With that, he walked back to his seat, leaving Margot and Marcus to contemplate the choices that lay ahead of them, and the man who had shown them that sometimes the most powerful response to conflict wasn't escalation, but grace. The cockpit of Flight 447 hummed with the quiet efficiency of modern aviation, banks of monitors displaying everything from fuel consumption to weather patterns thousands of miles ahead. Captain Rebecca Allen sat in the left seat with the relaxed alertness of someone who had logged over 15,000 hours in commercial aircraft, her hands resting lightly on the controls as the autopilot guided them across the vast Pacific. She had been flying for 22 years, one of the few women to break through the glass ceiling of long-haul international routes, and she had earned her position through a combination of skill, determination, and an almost supernatural ability to remain calm under pressure. But the message that had just come through from Marcus Dean was testing even her legendary composure. "Ma'am," her co-pilot, James Morrison, said carefully, "Are you sure about this? Protocol would be to divert to the nearest suitable airport. Passenger assault is a serious criminal matter." Rebecca stared out at the endless expanse of ocean below them, calculating distances, fuel loads, and the cascade of consequences that would follow any decision she made. A diversion to Honolulu would cost the airline hundreds of thousands of dollars, strand 300 passengers, and turn what was already a public relations nightmare into an international incident. "What do you know about the passenger in 3A?" she asked Morrison. "Steven Seagal? The actor?" Morrison shrugged. "Used to do action movies, right? Haven't seen him in anything lately." Rebecca had done her homework years ago when she first noticed his name on passenger manifests. Steven Seagal wasn't just an actor. He was a former CIA operative whose Hollywood career had been a carefully constructed cover for decades of real-world operations. The missions he had undertaken, the lives he had saved, the enemies he had eliminated, all of it was classified, buried so deep that most people would never know the truth about what he had really done for his country. But Rebecca knew. Her father had been Air Force, had worked with special operations, and he had told her stories about the quiet men who operated in the shadows, the ones whose real heroism would never be acknowledged in public. When she had seen Seagal's name on flight manifests over the years, always traveling alone, always unassuming, she had recognized him for what he really was, a warrior who had earned his retirement from the spotlight. A soft chime indicated an incoming call from the cabin, and Marcus Dean's voice crackled through the intercom, tight with stress and uncertainty. "Captain Allen, we need to discuss the situation in first class." "Go ahead, Marcus." "The passenger. In 3A, Mr. Seagal, he's handling this very differently than we expected. He's not demanding legal action, not threatening lawsuits. He's actually counseling our flight attendant." Rebecca felt her eyebrows rise. "Counseling? Her? Ma'am, I think he's former military. Maybe special forces. The way he's handling this crisis, the way he's reading people, it's not normal passenger behavior. He knew about Margot's daughter before anyone told him. He's dealing with this situation like someone who's had extensive training in crisis management and psychological operations." In the business class cabin, Elias Coe had been listening to the conversations drifting back from first class with the acute hearing of someone who had spent decades learning to read dangerous situations. At 78, he was still sharp, still alert, and when he had seen Steven Seagal board the plane, memories had come flooding back like a dam bursting. Korea, 1952. A classified operation behind enemy lines that had gone sideways when Chinese forces had surrounded their position. Elias had been a young sergeant then, part of a reconnaissance unit that had stumbled into something much bigger than intelligence gathering. They had been pinned down for 3 days, running low on ammunition and hope when the rescue team had arrived. The team leader had been a young man who moved like smoke through the darkness, who spoke in whispers and killed with surgical precision. Elias had never learned his real name. Operational security meant that Special Forces operators were identified only by code names. But years later, watching action movies with his grandchildren, he had recognized the face, the distinctive way the man moved, the particular brand of controlled violence that marked someone who had learned to kill professionally. The man who had saved Elias's life in Korea was now sitting 3 rows ahead of him, calmly dealing with a crisis that could have exploded into chaos. Elias wasn't surprised by Stephen's restraint. He had seen it before, in those dark mountains, where life and death decisions were made in split seconds. Elias unbuckled his seatbelt and made his way forward, moving with the careful dignity of advanced age. The first-class cabin was still tense, passengers speaking in hushed tones while stealing glances at Stephen and Amelia. The little girl was coloring quietly, the ice pack pressed against her cheek, while her grandfather sat beside her with the watchful stillness of a guardian. "Excuse me," Elias said softly, stopping beside Stephen's seat. "I wonder if I might have a word." Stephen looked up, and their eyes met with the instant recognition of soldiers who had shared a battlefield. Elias saw the moment when Stephen remembered the mountains, the rescue, the young sergeant who had been more grateful for salvation than afraid of the men who had provided it. "Sergeant Coe," Stephen said quietly, rising to shake hands. "It's been a long time." 70 years, Elias confirmed. "You saved my life." "You saved your own life," Stephen replied. "I just helped you get home." The 2 men stood in the aisle, surrounded by the ambient noise of air travel, but somehow inhabiting a space that was separate from everyone else. They were connected by shared experience, by the kind of bond that could only be forged under extreme circumstances. "I heard what happened," Elias said, "and I heard how you're handling it." Stephen glanced toward the galley, where Margot was still talking quietly with Marcus. "She's not the enemy here. She's a casualty." "Most people wouldn't see it that way. Most people haven't had to make the kinds of choices we've had to make," Stephen replied. "They haven't learned that sometimes the hardest fight is knowing when not to fight." Elias nodded slowly. In the decades since Korea, he had watched America change, had seen violence become entertainment, had witnessed the erosion of the values that had once made service meaningful. But standing here with Steven Seagal, he was reminded that some things remained constant: honor, duty, the willingness to protect others even when they couldn't protect themselves. "My son lives in Sydney," Elias said. "We haven't spoken in 5 years. I'm going there to try to make things right before it's too late." "Family is the only thing that really matters," Stephen said, glancing at Amelia. "Everything else is just noise." Back in the cockpit, Captain Allen was making her decision. She had listened to Marcus's report, had considered the options, had weighed the risks and benefits of each possible course of action. But in the end, her choice came down to trust. Trust in her instincts, trust in her assessment of character, trust in the quiet man in 3A who was handling an impossible situation with grace and wisdom. "Morrison," she said finally, "log the incident but maintain course for Sydney. No diversion." "Ma'am, are you sure about this? If corporate finds out we had a passenger assault and didn't divert, corporate will find out regardless," Rebecca said. "The question is whether we handle this professionally or whether we panic and make everything worse. I'm betting on the professional approach." She reached for the cabin intercom, her voice carrying the authority of command when she spoke to the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're currently cruising at 41,000 feet, with clear skies and favorable winds. We'll be beginning our descent into Sydney in approximately 90 minutes. I want to take this opportunity to remind everyone that air travel brings people together from all walks of life, and sometimes we're called upon to show grace and understanding to our fellow travelers. Thank you for your patience and courtesy." The announcement was subtle, but experienced travelers understood its meaning. Something had happened, something had been handled, and everyone was expected to act with dignity and discretion. In premium economy, Sasha Green was staring at her phone, watching her follower count continue to drop as the backlash against her latest video intensified. The comments were brutal, accusing her of everything from selling out to losing her authenticity. But for the first time since she had started building her online presence, she found herself caring less about the numbers and more about the impact of her actions. She had built her brand on being reactive, on amplifying drama and conflict for entertainment value. But watching Steven Seagal's response to the crisis, his calm dignity, his refusal to escalate, his focus on healing rather than revenge, had forced her to confront an uncomfortable truth about herself and the culture she had helped create. "Hey everyone," she said quietly into her phone, starting what she knew might be her final video of the flight. "I want to talk about something that's been bothering me. We live in a world where everyone wants to go viral, where every moment of drama becomes content, where other people's pain becomes our entertainment. And I've been part of that. I've contributed to it." She paused, looking around the cabin at the other passengers, most of whom were deliberately avoiding eye contact with her. "But I just witnessed something that made me realize how toxic that can be. I saw a man who had every right to be angry, every justification for revenge, choose compassion instead. And it made me ask myself, what kind of person do I want to be? What kind of world do I want to help create?" The response was immediate and predictable. Her remaining followers began abandoning her in droves, accusing her of weakness, of capitulating to pressure, of betraying everything her brand represented. But for the first time in years, Sasha found herself not caring about the metrics. She was thinking about the little girl in first class, about the flight attendant who had broken down under pressure, about the grandfather who had turned a moment of crisis into an opportunity for healing. As the plane continued its journey towards Sydney, carrying its cargo of transformed lives and hard-won wisdom, the sun was beginning to set over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that no camera could quite capture. And in seat 3A, Steven Seagal sat quietly beside his granddaughter, watching her color a picture of a plane surrounded by clouds, while contemplating the choices that had brought them all to this moment, and the choices that would define what came next. The digital wildfire that Sasha Green had ignited was spreading faster than anyone could have anticipated, consuming bandwidth and attention spans across the global internet at the speed of light. Hashtag flight attendant SLAPS child was trending worldwide. Now, competing with international news and celebrity scandals for the top spot on social media platforms. The 30-second clip had been viewed over 10 million times, shared by outraged merchants and digital vigilantes who saw injustice and demanded immediate, brutal justice in return. But something unexpected was happening in the comment sections and reply threads. Mixed in with the predictable calls for the flight attendant's head was a growing conversation about the man who had defused the situation. Screenshots of Steven Seagal's calm response were being analyzed frame by frame. His restraint was being dissected, debated, and increasingly praised. "Look at this guy's body language," wrote one commenter who had slowed the video down to examine every gesture. "Military training for sure. See how he positions himself between the child and the threat. Classic protective stance." "That's Steven Seagal," another replied. "Used to be a big action star in the 90s. But word is he was never really acting. Guy's supposed to be legitimate special forces." The conversation was evolving from simple outrage into something more complex, a discussion about appropriate response, about strength and restraint, about what real heroism looked like in the modern world. It was the kind of nuanced dialogue that rarely emerged from viral content, and it was making some people uncomfortable. Sasha was watching this evolution in real time, her phone buzzing constantly with notifications as the story continued to develop. News outlets were reaching out, offering five-figure sums for exclusive interviews. Podcast hosts wanted her to appear on their shows. Literary agents were contacting her about book deals. The incident had created opportunities that most influencers could only dream of. But every time she considered accepting one of these offers, she thought about the conversation she had overheard in the galley, about Steven's quiet compassion and Margot's broken grief. The idea of monetizing their pain, of turning their trauma into her profit, made her feel sick in a way that had nothing to do with turbulence. 3 rows ahead, Amelia was showing her grandfather the latest addition to her drawing, a figure that looked remarkably like him, standing between her and what appeared to be a storm cloud with angry eyes. "Is that me?" Stephen asked, studying the crayon artwork with the serious attention that children's creativity deserved. "That's you protecting me from the scary lady," Amelia said matter-of-factly. "But she's not scary anymore. She's just sad." Stephen felt his heart skip a beat. His granddaughter's emotional intelligence never ceased to amaze him. At 5 years old, she had somehow understood something that most adults struggled with, that hurt people, and that healing required compassion rather than condemnation. "That's right, sweetheart," he said softly. "Sometimes when people are very sad about something, they do things they don't really mean to do. It doesn't make it okay, but it helps us understand why it happened. Like when I hit Tommy at preschool, because he said mommy wasn't coming back." The question hit Stephen like a physical blow. They had never discussed that incident in quite those terms before. Amelia had been acting out in the months after her mother's death, and he had chalked it up to normal grief processing. But now he realized that she had been dealing with the same anger and helplessness that had driven Margot to lose control. "Yes," he said finally. "Exactly like that. You were hurting, and you didn't know how to handle all those big feelings, so you let them out in a way that hurt someone else. But you didn't get mad at me," Amelia said. "You helped me understand why I was sad. And that's what we're trying to do for the sad lady too," Stephen explained. "We're trying to help her understand why she's sad, so she can get better." In the business class cabin, a young man named David Chun was frantically typing on his laptop, trying to stay ahead of the news cycle that was developing around the incident. As a reporter for the Sydney Morning Herald, he had been monitoring social media during the flight when the story broke. Now he was facing the journalistic opportunity of the decade: exclusive access to the biggest story on the internet. But every time he started to write about the drama, the conflict, the perfect narrative of victim and perpetrator, he found himself distracted by the larger questions the incident raised. What drove a 22-year veteran flight attendant to such an extreme action? What kind of man could respond to violence against his own family with such measured restraint? And what did this say about society's hunger for instant judgment and viral justice? David had been trained to find the angle, to craft the story that would generate the most clicks and shares. But this story felt different, more complex than the typical viral controversy. There were layers here that couldn't be captured in a clickbait headline or a 280-character summary. He glanced toward first class, where Seagal sat quietly with his granddaughter, oblivious to the digital storm swirling around him. The man seemed to exist in a bubble of calm that was impervious to the chaos of modern media culture. It was as if he had learned to operate by different rules, in a reality where actions had consequences beyond their entertainment value. Back in premium economy, Sasha was composing what she knew would be her most important post ever. She had deleted the original video, taking a massive hit to her engagement metrics in the process, and was now trying to articulate something that felt true rather than something that would go viral. "I've been thinking a lot about what I witnessed today," she wrote, her thumb hovering over the publish button. "About the difference between recording something and really seeing it. About whether we have a responsibility to protect people's pain instead of broadcasting it. About what it means to be strong in a world that rewards being loud." The words felt inadequate, too small to contain the scope of what she had experienced. How could she explain the transformation she had witnessed the way Seagal had turned a moment of crisis into an opportunity for grace? How could she convey the profound impact of watching someone choose healing over revenge, understanding over judgment? "I think we've forgotten that real strength isn't about winning or dominating or being right," she continued. "Real strength is about knowing when not to fight, when to show mercy, when to choose love over hate. I saw that today from a man who had every reason to choose differently, and it changed me." She posted the message and immediately watched her follower count begin to plummet. The backlash was swift and brutal. Accusations of being bought off, of going soft, of betraying her brand. But mixed in with the criticism were messages of support from people who had been waiting for someone to say what she had just said, who were tired of the endless cycle of outrage and ready for something more constructive. One message in particular caught her attention. "Thank you for being brave enough to choose compassion over clicks. The world needs more people like you." The sender was someone with only a handful of followers, probably nobody important in the usual sense. But the message carried more weight than all the criticism combined, because it recognized something that Sasha was only beginning to understand: that influence without integrity was just noise, that true impact came from lifting people up rather than tearing them down. As the plane began its initial descent towards Sydney, Captain Allen's voice crackled over the intercom one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our approach to Sydney Kingsford Smith Airport. Local time is 6:45 a.m., and it's going to be a beautiful morning. I want to thank everyone for your patience and courtesy during today's flight. Air travel brings together people from all walks of life, and sometimes we're reminded that our shared humanity is more important than our differences." The message was subtle but clear. They had all been part of something significant, something that transcended the usual boundaries of commercial aviation. They had witnessed a masterclass in crisis management, in emotional intelligence, in the kind of leadership that didn't depend on title or authority, but on character and wisdom. In Seat 3A, Stephen was helping Amelia put away her coloring books and prepare for landing. The red mark on her cheek had faded to a pale pink, and she seemed to have processed the incident with the resilience that children brought to trauma when they felt safe and supported. "Grandpa," she said as the plane banked toward the runway, "are we going to see the sad lady again?" "Probably," Stephen replied. "Why?" "I want to give her my picture," Amelia said, holding up the drawing she had been working on, a plane surrounded by clouds, with a bright sun breaking through the darkness. "So she knows that storms don't last forever." Stephen looked at his granddaughter with wonder and pride. At 5 years old, she had grasped something that most adults spent lifetimes trying to understand: that healing happened not through punishment, but through connection, not through judgment, but through grace. As the wheels touched down on Australian soil and the plane taxied toward the gate, Stephen knew that their journey was far from over. The media would be waiting, the legal system would have questions, and the digital mob would demand answers. But he also knew that they had already won the most important victory. They had chosen to respond to hate with love, to pain with compassion, to crisis with wisdom. The plane came to a stop at the gate, and the familiar sound of seatbelt buckles clicking filled the cabin. But before anyone could stand, Stephen reached across the aisle and caught Elias Ko's eye. "Thank you," Stephen said simply. "Thank you," Elias replied. And in those two words was the recognition of service, sacrifice, and the bonds that connected warriors across time and space. As the passengers began to disembark, carrying with them the memory of what they had witnessed, the sun was rising over Sydney Harbor, painting the sky in shades of gold and promise. And somewhere in the digital ether, a new kind of viral content was beginning to spread, not the usual diet of outrage and division, but something rarer and more precious: a story of redemption, of the power of choosing grace over grievance, of the quiet strength that could transform crisis into opportunity for healing. The final hour of the flight had transformed the cabin into something approaching a sanctuary, a place where profound truths were being spoken and fundamental transformations were taking place. The galley, once a scene of crisis and confrontation, had become a confessional where three very different people were learning to see themselves and each other with unprecedented clarity. Marcus Dean stood with his back against the beverage cart, watching as Margot Hill and Sasha Green sat across from each other at the small crew table. Steven Seagal had requested this meeting, not as a demand, but as a gentle suggestion that carried the weight of moral authority. What was unfolding was unlike anything Marcus had witnessed in 15 years of managing airline operations. "I need to say something," Sasha began, her voice barely above a whisper. She had put her phone away completely, its constant buzzing finally silenced. "When I recorded what happened, I wasn't thinking about you as a real person. You were just content, a story, something to feed to my followers." Margot looked up from her hands, which she had been studying with intense concentration. The last hour had been a journey through territory she had never expected to navigate. Honest conversation about grief, loss, and the ways that pain could transform people into versions of themselves they didn't recognize. "I understand," Margot said quietly. "I wasn't thinking about Amelia as a real person either. In that moment, she was just noise, something disrupting my ability to do my job. I forgot that she was a child who had lost her mother, who was scared and needed comfort. The admission hung in the air between them, raw and honest in a way that social media had never allowed for. There were no filters here, no careful curation of image and brand. Just three human beings grappling with the consequences of choices made in moments of weakness. I've built my entire career on being reactive, Sasha continued, on finding drama and amplifying it for entertainment. But watching how Mr. Seagal handled this situation, the way he chose understanding over revenge, healing over harm, it made me realize how toxic that approach really is. Stephen had been listening from his position near the galley entrance, present but not dominating the conversation. His role here was not to lecture or judge, but to create space for truth, to hold the silence that allowed people to confront themselves honestly. The thing is, Sasha said, looking directly at Margot, I lost my dad when I was 12. Cancer. And afterward, I was angry all the time. I lashed out at everyone. My mom, my teachers, my friends. I turned that anger into content, into a brand, built on calling people out and tearing them down. But I was really just a hurt kid who never learned how to process loss. Margot's eyes filled with tears again, but they were different tears than the ones she had shed earlier. These were tears of recognition, of seeing herself reflected in someone she had initially dismissed as shallow and self-serving. Emma would have been horrified by what I did today, Margot said softly. She was the most gentle, compassionate child. Even when she was in pain, even during the worst of her treatments, she worried about other people. She used to comfort the other kids in the cancer ward, tell them stories to help them forget their fear. Tell me about her, Stephen said quietly, and the simple request opened a floodgate. For the next 20 minutes, Margot spoke about her daughter with the kind of detail that only love could provide. Emma's laugh, her favorite books, the way she insisted on wearing mismatched socks because she said it made the world more colorful. The stories painted a picture of a child who had faced terminal illness with remarkable grace, who had spent her final months teaching the adults around her what courage really looked like. She made me promise that I would help other people, Margot said finally. In her last weeks, when she knew she wasn't going to make it, she made me promise that I would find ways to make the world a little bit better. And instead, I hurt someone else's child. The weight of that realization settled over the galley like a heavy blanket. But Stephen had seen this moment before, in other contexts, with other people who had reached the bottom of their pain, and found something solid to stand on. Emma's promise is still there, he said gently. This doesn't have to be the end of your ability to help people. It can be the beginning of a different kind of service. Marcus had been quiet throughout this exchange, but now he found himself compelled to speak. The conversation had forced him to confront his own motivations, his own choices, the ways he had prioritized corporate interests over human needs. We failed you, he said to Margot. The airline, I mean. We knew you had lost your daughter. We knew you were grieving, but we didn't really support you. We gave you time off, sure, but we didn't address the underlying issues. We put you back in a high-stress situation without proper mental health support. The admission was professionally dangerous. Acknowledging institutional failure could expose the airline to liability. But Marcus had reached a point where doing the right thing mattered more than protecting the bottom line. I've been thinking about our employee assistance programs, he continued. They're inadequate, tokenistic. We treat mental health like a checkbox item instead of a fundamental part of workplace safety. That has to change. Stephen nodded approvingly. This was what he had been hoping for. Not just individual transformation, but systemic change, the kind of institutional evolution that could prevent future tragedies. What would real support look like? Sasha asked. She had pulled out a notebook and was taking notes, not for content, but for her own understanding. The experience was teaching her the difference between observing for entertainment and bearing witness for growth. Mandatory mental health screenings after any major life event. Marcus said, his mind working through possibilities. Real counseling services, not just a hotline. Flexible scheduling for people dealing with trauma. A culture that prioritizes employee well-being over operational efficiency. And accountability, Stephen added. Systems that recognize when someone is struggling before they reach a breaking point. Training for managers to identify warning signs. Support networks that actually support. The conversation was interrupted by Captain Allen's voice over the intercom, announcing their final approach to Sydney. But instead of breaking the spell, the announcement seemed to intensify it. adding urgency to the transformation taking place in the galley. "I want to apologize," Margot said suddenly, standing up. To Amelia. Directly. Not through lawyers or corporate representatives, but person to person. Stephen studied her face, reading the sincerity there. "Are you ready for that? Really ready?" "I need to be," Margot replied. "Emma would expect me to be." The walk from the galley to seat 3A felt like a mile, though it was only a few steps. Passengers sensed the significance of the moment, conversations quieting as Margot approached the little girl who was still coloring quietly by the window. Amelia looked up as Margot knelt beside her seat, and there was no fear in her eyes, only curiosity and the kind of emotional intelligence that some children possessed in abundance. "Hi, sweetie," Margot said softly. "My name is Margot. I'm the flight attendant who hurt you earlier." "I know," Amelia said matter-of-factly. "Grandpa told me you're very sad about something." The simple statement nearly broke Margot's composure, but she pressed on. "I am very sad. I lost someone very important to me, and I let that sadness make me do something terrible. I hurt you, and I'm so sorry." Amelia considered this seriously, her crayon poised over her drawing. "My mommy died," she said finally. "Sometimes that makes me really mad, and I want to hit things too." "Yes," Margot said, tears streaming down her face. "That's exactly what happened to me. But that doesn't make it okay. You didn't deserve to be hurt because I was sad." Amelia nodded solemnly, then reached into her backpack and pulled out the drawing she had been working on. The plane surrounded by clouds, with sunlight breaking through. "This is for you," she said, offering the paper to Margot. "Grandpa says that storms don't last forever, and that sad people need to remember that the sun is still there, even when we can't see it." Margot accepted the drawing with hands that shook with emotion. The simple act of receiving forgiveness from a child she had wronged was more powerful than any absolution she could have received from adults. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'll keep this forever." As Margot stood and walked back toward the galley, she felt something shift inside her. Not a complete healing, but the beginning of one. The path ahead would be difficult, involving professional consequences, legal proceedings, and the long work of rebuilding her relationship with herself. But for the first time since Emma's death, she felt like that work might be possible. Behind her, Stephen was helping Amelia put away her coloring supplies, but his eyes were on Margot's retreating figure. He recognized the moment when someone stepped from darkness into light, when the possibility of redemption became real rather than theoretical. The plane was descending now, Sydney's skyline coming into view through the windows. In a few minutes, they would all return to their separate lives, but they would carry with them the memory of what was possible when people chose compassion over condemnation, healing over harm. As the landing gear extended with a mechanical thump, Stephen reflected on the strange journey that had brought them all to this moment. A simple flight had become a crucible, a place where ordinary people had been forced to confront extraordinary questions about forgiveness, redemption, and the possibility of transformation. The plane touched down with barely a bump, smooth and professional, and as they taxied toward the gate, Stephen knew that the real journey was just beginning. The last 30 minutes of Flight 447 passed in a state of suspended animation, as if the entire aircraft had been transformed into a meditation retreat floating above the Pacific Ocean. The earlier drama had given way to something deeper and more profound, a collective processing of what they had all witnessed and participated in. Captain Rebecca Allen's voice came over the intercom one final time, but her words carried weight that went beyond the usual arrival announcements. "Ladies and gentlemen, as we make our final approach to Sydney Kingsford Smith Airport, I want to take a moment to reflect on our journey together today. Air travel has a unique way of bringing together people from different walks of life, different backgrounds, different perspectives. Sometimes we're reminded that our shared humanity transcends whatever differences we might have." She paused, choosing her words carefully. Allen had been flying for over 2 decades, had seen everything from medical emergencies to unruly passengers, but she had never experienced anything quite like what had unfolded in her cabin today. Today we witnessed both the worst and the best of human nature. We saw how pain and grief can drive people to actions they never imagined possible. But we also saw how compassion, understanding, and forgiveness can transform a moment of crisis into an opportunity for healing and growth. In the cockpit, her co-pilot James Morrison was monitoring the approach, but he was also listening to Alan's words with growing respect. This wasn't the standard corporate speak that passengers usually heard. This was a woman speaking from her heart about something that had moved her deeply. "I want to commend everyone for the dignity and grace you've shown today," Alan continued. "Particularly the gentleman in 3A, who demonstrated that true strength lies not in retaliation, but in restraint, not in punishment, but in understanding." His response to a difficult situation reminded us all what real leadership looks like. In first class, Stephen felt the weight of the captain's words, but also their inadequacy. He hadn't acted with any thought of being an example or demonstrating leadership. He had simply done what felt right, what his granddaughter needed to see, what his own moral compass demanded. Amelia was fast asleep now, her head resting against the window, one small hand still clutching the butterfly hair clip that had belonged to her mother. The angry red mark on her cheek had faded to a barely visible pink, but Stephen knew that the emotional impact of the incident would take longer to heal. Children were resilient, but they also absorbed more than adults often realized. Across the aisle, Elias Coe was watching the approach to Sydney with eyes that held decades of memory. He had made this journey many times over the years, but never with the sense of purpose that filled him now. Watching Stephen's response to crisis had reminded him of something he had forgotten, that the battles that mattered most were often fought not with weapons, but with words, not through violence, but through understanding. His son Michael lived in Sydney's eastern suburbs, a successful lawyer who had grown tired of his father's war stories and periodic attempts to reconnect. Their relationship had been strained for years, damaged by misunderstandings and the particular kind of generational conflict that seemed to afflict many immigrant families. But witnessing Stephen's quiet grace under pressure had inspired Elias to try a different approach, one based on listening rather than lecturing, understanding rather than judgment. In premium economy, Sasha Green was staring out the window at the approaching Australian coastline, her phone powered down for the first time in hours. The social media storm she had triggered was still raging, but she was no longer interested in feeding it. The experience of the last few hours had fundamentally altered her relationship with digital fame and the culture of viral content. She had lost over 200,000 followers since deleting the original video and posting her reflection on compassion over clicks. Her management team had been calling nonstop, demanding explanations, threatening to drop her if she didn't return to her established brand of confrontational content. But for the first time since building her online presence, Sasha found herself more interested in who she was becoming than in who her audience wanted her to be. The young reporter David Chun was still typing furiously on his laptop, but the story he was crafting bore little. The Boeing 777 came to rest at Gate 12 of Sydney Kingsford Smith Airport with the gentle finality of a journey completed, but everyone aboard understood that something far more significant than a flight had just concluded. The familiar sounds of an aircraft powering down, the dying whine of engines, the soft hiss of hydraulics, the electronic chimes signaling systems shut down, seemed muted, as if the plane itself was observing a moment of reverence for what had transpired at 35,000 feet. Stephen gathered Amelia's belongings with the methodical care that had become second nature over the months since he'd become her primary guardian. She was still drowsy from her nap, rubbing her eyes and asking if they were really in Australia. Now, the excitement in her voice was tinged with uncertainty, the particular mix of anticipation and anxiety that children felt when facing big changes. "Yes, sweetheart," he said softly, helping her into her small backpack. "We're home." The word felt strange on his lips. Home had been many places over the years: military bases, safe houses, hotel rooms in countries whose names he couldn't mention. But looking at Amelia, he understood that home wasn't a place anymore. It was wherever she felt safe, wherever she could heal and grow without the shadows of the past following them. Captain Allen's voice crackled over the intercom one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Sydney. Local time is 7:15 a.m., and it's a beautiful morning. Before you disembark, I want to thank you all for your patience and grace during today's flight. Sometimes travel brings out the best in people, and today was one of those times." As the seatbelt sign chimed off, Passengers began the familiar ritual of gathering their belongings, but there was something different about the usual post-flight energy. Conversations were quieter, more thoughtful. People were stealing glances at Stephen and Amelia, at Margot Hill, who was standing near the galley with red-rimmed eyes, at Sasha Green, who was conspicuously not filming her arrival experience. Marcus Dean approached Stephen as he stood to collect their carry-on luggage. The head of cabin crew looked like he had aged years in the past few hours, the weight of institutional change and personal accountability etched into the lines around his eyes. "Mr. Seagal," Marcus said quietly, "I want you to know that I'll be filing a comprehensive report about what happened today. Not the sanitized version corporate would prefer, but the truth. About Margot's situation, about our failures as an employer, about the changes we need to make." Stephen studied the younger man's face, reading the sincerity there. "That won't be easy for you professionally." "No," Marcus agreed. "But after watching how you handled this situation, I realized that easy isn't always right. Sometimes doing the right thing costs you something." Stephen extended his hand, and Marcus shook it with the firm grip of someone who had just discovered his own spine. "Your employees are lucky to have someone willing to advocate for them." "I should have been advocating all along," Marcus replied. "That's going to change." As they prepared to leave the aircraft, Margot Hill stepped forward, her movements tentative but determined. She was carrying Amelia's drawing carefully, as if it were made of spun glass rather than crayon and paper. "Mr. Seagal," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I know there will be legal proceedings, investigations, consequences for what I did. I want you to know that I'll face all of it. No lawyers trying to minimize my actions, no corporate protection. I did something inexcusable, and I'll take responsibility." Stephen looked at her for a long moment. This broken woman who was somehow finding strength in her own ruins. "Accountability isn't about punishment, Margot. It's about learning. About making sure this never happens to another child, another family." "I understand," she said. "I've already contacted a grief counselor. Real help this time, not just employee assistance program brochures. And I'm going to volunteer at the children's hospital where Emma was treated. She wanted me to help people, and maybe this is how I can honor that." Amelia, who had been listening with the intense concentration that children brought to adult conversations they didn't fully understand, suddenly tugged on Margot's uniform sleeve. "Are you going to be okay?" she asked with the direct compassion that only children could manage. Margot knelt to Amelia's eye level, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know, sweetheart, but I'm going to try really hard to be better. Thank you for forgiving me." "Grandpa says forgiveness helps the hurt stop hurting," Amelia replied matter-of-factly. "But it takes time." The simple wisdom of a 5-year-old hung in the air like a benediction. Around them, passengers were filing off the plane, but this small group remained, bound together by shared experience and the recognition that they had all been changed by what had transpired. Sasha Green approached hesitantly, her phone conspicuously absent from her hands. "Mr. Seagal, I wanted to apologize for recording what happened, and for what I initially planned to do with that content. You showed me something today about real strength, about choosing grace over grievance. I won't forget that." Stephen nodded, understanding that her transformation, like Margot's, was just beginning. "Use your platform wisely," he said simply. "You have the ability to influence how people think and feel. That's a responsibility, not just an opportunity." As they finally made their way off the aircraft, Stephen noticed that Captain Allen was waiting in the jetway, having left the cockpit to personally see them off. She approached with the bearing of someone who had spent decades in command, but also with unmistakable respect. "Mr. Seagal," she said, extending her hand. "It's been an honor having you aboard. What you did today, the way you handled that situation, it reminded me why I became a pilot in the first place. Sometimes we forget that we're not just transporting passengers. We're carrying human beings with stories, struggles, dreams." She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small pair of plastic pilot wings, the kind airlines gave to children. "For Amelia," she said, pinning them carefully to the little girl's shirt. "Welcome to Australia, Captain." Amelia beamed, touching the wings with reverent fingers. "Can I really be a pilot?" "You can be anything you want to be," Captain Allen replied. "But remember what your grandfather showed us today, that the best leaders are the ones who help others fly." As they walked through the terminal, Stephen could see the media circus that awaited them beyond the security checkpoint. News vans lined the pickup area, reporters clutched microphones and cameras, and the whole apparatus of modern media consumption was gearing up to devour their story. But instead of heading toward the main exit, Stephen guided Amelia toward a service corridor where Captain Allen had arranged for them to meet their ride. Sometimes the most important journeys happened away from the cameras, in the quiet spaces where real healing could begin. Behind them, the other passengers from Flight 447 were dispersing into their own lives, carrying with them the memory of what they had witnessed. Each would process the experience differently, but all had been touched by the recognition that ordinary moments could become extraordinary when people chose compassion over conflict, understanding over anger. As Stephen and Amelia walked toward their new life in Australia, the morning sun was painting Sydney Harbor in shades of gold and promise, and the future stretched ahead like an unwritten story waiting to be filled with hope. 3 days after Flight 447 touched down in Sydney, the ripple effects of what had happened at 35,000 feet were still spreading across the globe like stones thrown into a vast digital pond. But the story that was emerging bore little resemblance to the viral outrage cycle that had initially consumed social media. Instead, something unprecedented was happening. A genuine conversation about grace, accountability, and the possibility of redemption in an age of instant judgment. Sasha Green sat in a small cafe in Sydney's Paddington district, her laptop open to a draft that had taken her 47 attempts to write. The final video in what she was calling her Flight 447 series was unlike anything she had ever produced. Gone were the quick cuts, the dramatic music, the carefully crafted outrage that had built her following. Instead, it was simply her, sitting in natural light, talking about what it meant to choose substance over spectacle. I've spent 3 years building an audience by amplifying drama and turning other people's pain into my content, she said to the camera, her voice steady but vulnerable. But I learned something on that flight that I want to share with you. Real influence isn't about going viral or getting the most likes. It's about using whatever platform you have to make the world a little bit better, a little bit kinder. The response had been remarkable. Yes, she had lost followers, nearly 500,000 of them, but the ones who remained were different. They were engaging with her content in deeper ways, sharing their own stories of loss and redemption, creating a community built on authenticity rather than anger. Brands were already reaching out, not for the confrontational content that had made her famous, but for the thoughtful perspective she was developing. More importantly, the video had inspired other creators to examine their own relationships with viral culture. Hashtag Choose Compassion was trending, but it wasn't the usual performative hashtag activism. Creators across platforms were sharing stories of times they had chosen empathy over engagement, understanding over outrage. The conversation was changing, slowly but measurably. At Sydney Children's Hospital, Margot Hill was beginning her first day as a volunteer in the pediatric oncology ward. She had resigned from the airline, a decision that Marcus Dean had initially refused to accept until he understood that she needed to rebuild her relationship with service from the ground up. The legal proceedings were still pending, but her lawyer had been surprised by the lack of criminal charges. Steven Seagal had quietly influenced the prosecutor's decision, arguing that justice was better served through rehabilitation than incarceration. Margot wore a simple name tag that read volunteer, with no mention of her previous career or the incident that had brought her here. To the children in the ward, she was simply Miss Margot, the lady who read stories and helped with art projects, and somehow understood exactly what it felt like when everything hurt. "Are you sad today?" asked a 7-year-old named Tommy, who was undergoing treatment for leukemia. He had the particular perceptiveness that children fighting serious illness often developed, an ability to see through adult pretenses to the truth underneath. "A little bit," Margot admitted, sitting beside his bed. "But being here with you makes me feel better. Sometimes helping other people is the best medicine for sadness." Tommy nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense to him. "My mom says that too. She says when we help people, it makes the hurt smaller." Margot felt tears sting her eyes, but they were different tears than the ones she had shed on the plane. These were tears of recognition, of purpose being slowly rebuilt from the ruins of grief. Emma would have liked Tommy, would have appreciated his wisdom and courage. And maybe, Somehow, this work was a way of honoring her daughter's memory while helping other children and families navigate their own dark valleys. In the executive offices of the airline, Marcus Dean was presenting his comprehensive report to a room full of nervous executives who had expected a damage control briefing and instead received a blueprint for cultural transformation. The recommendations were extensive and expensive: mandatory mental health support for all employees, revised bereavement leave policies, regular wellness screenings, and a complete overhaul of how the company approached employee crisis management. The bottom line, Marcus concluded, is that we failed Margot Hill long before she failed us. We treated grief like a temporary inconvenience rather than a fundamental human experience that requires ongoing support. If we want to prevent future incidents, we need to invest in our people's well-being, not just their productivity. The CFO was already calculating costs, the legal department was assessing liability implications, and the PR team was crafting statements. But the CEO, a woman who had climbed the corporate ladder by making tough decisions, was thinking about something Steven Seagal had said in his quiet conversation with Marcus. You can't buy integrity, but you can choose it. Implement the recommendations, she said finally. All of them. And I want Margot Hill's healthcare covered for as long as she needs it. This company is going to be better because of what happened, not despite it. Meanwhile, in a modest house in Sydney's northern beaches, Steven Seagal was helping Amelia plant a small lemon tree in their backyard. The house was nothing special: 3 bedrooms, a small garden, neighborhood sounds drifting over the fence, but it felt like sanctuary after years of running from the past. Will it grow big, Grandpa? Amelia asked, carefully patting soil around the sapling's roots. It'll take time, Steven replied, kneeling beside her in the red Australian earth. Trees grow slowly, but they grow strong. And someday, maybe when you're older, we'll make lemonade from its fruit, like Mommy used to make. Maybe even better, Steven said. And for the first time since his daughter's death, the words didn't feel like a betrayal. Laura was gone, would always be gone, but her love lived on in Amelia's laugh, in the way she approached the world with curiosity rather than fear, in the strength she was already showing at 5 years old. That evening, as Amelia colored at the kitchen table and Steven prepared dinner, his phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. He almost ignored it. His contact information was carefully guarded, but something made him check. Thank you for showing me what strength really looks like. I'll never forget Flight 447. Marcus, Steven smiled and deleted the message. He didn't need gratitude or recognition for doing what felt right. But he was glad that others were carrying forward the lessons learned at 35,000 feet, that the ripples of compassion were continuing to spread. Later, as he tucked Amelia into bed, she showed him her latest drawing, a house surrounded by trees, with 2 figures standing in the garden. Above them, she had drawn what looked like an angel with a familiar smile. That's Mommy, Amelia explained matter-of-factly. She's watching over us in our new home. Steven kissed her forehead and turned off the light, leaving only the soft glow of a nightlight shaped like a butterfly. In the darkness, he could hear the ocean in the distance, the eternal rhythm of waves that had been washing these shores long before he arrived and would continue long after he was gone. But for now, in this moment, there was peace. The past was finally past, the future was full of possibility, and a little girl who had lost too much was learning to dream again. Sometimes, Steven reflected, the greatest victories were the quietest ones, not the dramatic confrontations that made headlines, but the daily choice to build rather than destroy, to heal rather than harm, to choose love over fear. Outside, the Southern Cross blazed in the clear Australian sky, and tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose grace over grievance. But tonight, in a small house by the sea, 2 people who had found each other in loss were building something beautiful together. A family, a future, a testament to the truth that even in the darkest storms, the sun never really goes away. It just waits patiently for the clouds to pass. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.